Michel Foucault was one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century. His work changed how we understand power, knowledge, truth, and what it means to be human. Born in France in 1926, he died in 1984, but his ideas continue to shape how scholars think about society, politics, and human nature. Michel Foucault was a French historian and philosopher associated with the structuralist and post-structuralist movements. He has had strong influence not only in philosophy, but also in a wide range of humanistic and social scientific disciplines. Foucault's intellectual journey spanned nearly 3 decades of groundbreaking research. He became academically established during the 1960s, holding a series of positions at French universities before his election in 1969 to the prestigious Collège de France, where he was professor of the history of systems of thought until his death. His chair title itself reveals something crucial about his approach. He was not simply a philosopher or historian in the traditional sense. Instead, he studied how entire systems of human thinking emerge, develop, and transform over time. What makes Foucault so revolutionary is that he refused to accept the common division between theory and practice, between ideas and real life. Almost all of Foucault's works can be fruitfully read as philosophical in either or both of 2 ways, as carrying out philosophy's traditional critical project in a new historical manner, and as a critical engagement with the thought of traditional philosophers. He showed that the ideas we think are natural and universal are actually historical products that could be different. More importantly, he demonstrated that these ideas have real effects on how people live, suffer, and die. His work touches every aspect of human experience, from madness to sexuality, from crime to government, from medicine to ethics. Foucault revealed the hidden mechanisms that shape modern life. Michel Foucault was a major figure in 2 successive waves of 20th century French thought, the structuralist wave of the 1960s and then the post-structuralist wave. But he was never content to remain within academic boundaries. From the 1970s on, Foucault was very active politically. He was a founder of the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons and often protested on behalf of marginalized groups. This combination of rigorous scholarship and political engagement gives Foucault's work its unique power. He did not write about power and knowledge as abstract concepts. He showed how they operate in prisons, hospitals, schools, and government offices. He revealed how they shape the most intimate aspects of our lives, our sexuality, our sense of self, our understanding of what it means to be normal or abnormal. At the first decade of the 21st century, Foucault is the author most frequently cited in the humanities in general. This influence reflects not just his intellectual brilliance, but the urgent relevance of his insights for understanding our contemporary world. Part 1. The Dance Between Power and Knowledge. Revolutionary Understanding of Modern Control. The heart of Foucault's thinking lies in a simple but revolutionary idea that challenges everything we thought we knew about power and knowledge. Power and knowledge are not separate things that sometimes work together. Instead, they are so tightly connected that you cannot have one without the other. This insight transforms our understanding of politics, science, education, medicine, and every other domain of modern life. Foucault explored the fundamental relationship between power and knowledge, demonstrating how these concepts are inextricably linked in modern society. Most people think of power as something that some people have and others do not. We imagine power as a possession, like money or property, that can be accumulated, stored and used when needed. Similarly, we think of knowledge as objective truth that exists independently of human relations. We believe that science discovers facts about the world, and these facts are either true or false regardless of who believes them or how they are used. Foucault showed that both of these common-sense views are fundamentally wrong. Power is not a thing that people possess. Instead, it is a relationship that exists between people, institutions, and ideas. Foucault's understanding of power emphasizes its productive and creative aspects, showing how it generates new forms of knowledge, subjectivity, and resistance. Power does not just say no, prohibit, and punish. More importantly, it creates possibilities, shapes desires, and produces new forms of life. Think about this in your daily life. When a doctor tells you what is wrong with your body, they are using medical knowledge. But this knowledge also gives them power over you. You believe what they say because they know things you do not know. The doctor's knowledge creates their authority, and their authority helps create what counts as true knowledge about health and sickness. This is not a conspiracy or a conscious manipulation. It is the normal way that power and knowledge work together in modern societies. But the relationship goes much deeper than individual interactions between doctors and patients. The focus of his questioning is the modern human sciences. Biological, psychological, social. These purport to offer universal scientific truths about human nature that are, in fact, often mere expressions of ethical and political commitments of a particular society. Medical knowledge shapes not just what doctors know, but what kinds of questions they ask, what kinds of treatments they offer, and what kinds of people they consider healthy or sick. Consider how our understanding of mental illness has changed over time. In the medieval period, people who heard voices or saw visions might be considered holy mystics, touched by God. In the 1800s, they might be seen as morally corrupt individuals who had lost control of their passions. Today, they are likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia and treated with psychiatric medications. Each of these approaches creates different forms of knowledge about the human mind, but each also creates different forms of power over people who experience unusual mental states. Foucault's analysis reveals the paradoxical nature of this power-knowledge relationship, showing how knowledge both enables and constrains human possibilities. This is what makes Foucault's insight so unsettling. We usually think that knowledge is liberating. The more we know, the freer we become. But Foucault showed that knowledge also creates new forms of control and domination. The development of psychology, for example, gave us new ways to understand the human mind. But it also gave governments, employers, and institutions new ways to manage and control human behavior. Every society has what Foucault called regimes of truth. These are the complex systems that determine what counts as knowledge in a given time and place. They include not just scientific theories and facts, but also the institutions that produce and validate knowledge, the people who are authorized to speak as experts, and the procedures that are used to distinguish truth from falsehood. These regimes of truth are not natural or eternal. They are historical creations that change over time, and they are always connected to relations of power. Rather than asking what, in the apparently contingent, is actually necessary, he suggests asking what, in the apparently necessary, might be contingent. This shift in questioning opens up space for thinking differently about fundamental aspects of human life. It allows us to imagine that things could be otherwise than they are, and it gives us tools for working towards different possibilities. Part 2. The Architecture of Discourse: How Language Shapes Reality. Foucault spent much of his career studying what he called discourse, but discourse for him was much more than just language or conversation. Foucault introduced the concept of discourse as systems of thought that produce knowledge and regulate social practices. Discourse shapes how we think, what we can say, and even what we can imagine as possible. It operates like an invisible architecture that structures all human thinking and communication. Imagine discourse as an invisible set of rules that governs all our thinking. These rules tell us what kinds of questions we can ask, what kinds of answers make sense, and what kinds of knowledge count as legitimate. They determine not only what we can say, but also what it means to speak rationally, scientifically, or authoritatively. Foucault's analysis of discourse reveals how systems of thought produce knowledge and regulate social practices through complex power relations. Take the example of mental illness that we discussed earlier. In different historical periods, people have understood madness in completely different ways. Sometimes it was seen as divine inspiration, sometimes as moral failing, sometimes as medical disease. But these were not just different opinions about the same phenomenon. Each represented a completely different discourse with its own rules, concepts and procedures. In the medieval discourse of religion, madness was understood in terms of sin, salvation and divine intervention. The relevant experts were priests and theologians. The appropriate treatments involved prayer, confession and spiritual discipline. The mad person might be seen as either blessed by God or possessed by demons, but in either case their condition had deep spiritual significance. In the 18th century moral discourse, madness was understood in terms of reason, passion, and social order. The relevant experts were philosophers and moral reformers. The appropriate treatments involved education, discipline, and the cultivation of virtue. The mad person was seen as someone who had lost the capacity for rational self-control and needed to be restored to proper social functioning. In the modern medical discourse, madness is understood in terms of symptoms, diagnoses, and biological processes. The relevant experts are psychiatrists and neuroscientists. The appropriate treatments involve medication, therapy and clinical management. The mad person is seen as a patient with a medical condition that can be treated through scientific methods. Each of these discourses creates its own reality. They do not just describe mental illness, they actually constitute what mental illness is in each historical period. They determine what counts as evidence, what kinds of explanations are acceptable, and what forms of treatment are considered effective. They also create different possibilities for how mad people can understand themselves and be understood by others. But discourse operates at levels that are much more fundamental than our conscious beliefs and opinions. Discourse is the stretches of language which is socially used to convey broad conventional meaning. It shapes the basic categories through which we organize our experience. It determines what counts as an object of knowledge, what kinds of subjects are authorized to know, and what procedures are used to establish truth. Consider how the discourse of economics shapes our understanding of human behavior. Economic discourse treats people as rational actors who seek to maximize their individual utility. It assumes that all human relationships can be understood in terms of cost and benefit, supply and demand, efficiency and optimization. This discourse does not just describe how people behave, it actually shapes how people think about themselves and their relationships with others. When we think about education in economic terms, students become consumers, knowledge becomes a commodity, and learning becomes an investment in human capital. When we think about healthcare in economic terms, patients become customers, treatment becomes a service, and health becomes a matter of individual responsibility and market choice. When we think about the environment in economic terms, nature becomes a resource, pollution becomes an externality, and conservation becomes a matter of cost-benefit analysis. Each of these ways of thinking creates different possibilities for action and different forms of social organization. They determine not only what problems we recognize, but also what kinds of solutions we consider acceptable. Economic discourse makes certain forms of policy seem rational and necessary, while making others appear unrealistic or impossible. Foucault showed that discourse operates through institutions like schools, hospitals, prisons, and government agencies. These institutions do not just use discourse, they are built from it and help to reinforce it. Schools teach students not just particular subjects, but also particular ways of thinking, questioning, and reasoning. Hospitals organize medical knowledge and practice according to specific discursive rules. Government agencies develop policies based on particular assumptions about what counts as a social problem and what kinds of interventions are appropriate. But discourse also operates through everyday practices and interactions. For discourse is more than just ways of speaking or writing, it is a system of representation that is produced by and reproduces power relations. When we fill out forms, take tests, participate in meetings, or seek professional advice, we are participating in discursive practices that shape both our subjectivity and our social reality. This does not mean that discourse completely determines our thoughts and actions. Foucault was not arguing for a rigid determinism that leaves no room for human agency or resistance. Instead, he was showing how discourse creates the conditions within which we think and act. It provides the materials from which we construct our identities, relationships, and possibilities. Understanding how discourse works gives us tools to think critically about these conditions and to imagine alternative possibilities. Part 3. Digging through time, the archaeological method and hidden rules of thought. Foucault developed a unique way of studying the past that he called archaeology, but he was not digging up old pottery or ancient buildings. Instead, he was excavating the hidden structures of human thought and knowledge. The key idea of the archaeological method is that systems of thought and knowledge are governed by rules, beyond those of grammar and logic, that operate beneath the consciousness of individual subjects and define a system of conceptual possibilities. Think of ideas and knowledge systems like geological layers. Just as Earth builds up in layers over millions of years, human thinking builds up in layers over centuries. But unlike geological layers, these layers of thought are not simply stacked on top of each other. Instead, each historical period has its own complete system of knowledge with its own internal logic and coherence. Foucault's notion of archaeology can be broadly understood as an analytical tool for uncovering alternative and disturbed histories of systems of knowledge. Archaeology is the study of a cross-section of artifacts in a particular time. It is unlike mainstream history because it analyzes a variety of artifacts in one time period rather than tracing the development of one thing over a period of years. Instead of asking how one idea led to another over time, archaeology asks how all the different ideas in one period fit together to create a complete system of knowledge. This approach reveals something remarkable about human thought. It shows that what we consider rational, scientific, or obvious is actually the product of very specific historical conditions. For example, when Foucault studied the history of medicine in the birth of the clinic, he did not just look at how medical ideas changed over time. He looked at how medical knowledge worked together with ideas about the body, the soul, social organization, and moral behavior all at once. He discovered that around 1800 there was a fundamental transformation in how people understood disease, the human body, and medical knowledge itself. Before this transformation, illness was understood as a disturbance in the overall balance or harmony of the person. Disease was something that happened to the whole person in their particular environment and circumstances. Medical knowledge was based on careful observation of individual symptoms and the doctor's experience with similar cases. Treatment involved restoring the person's natural balance through diet, lifestyle changes, and gentle interventions. After the transformation, illness became understood as specific pathological processes localized in particular organs and tissues. Disease became something that could be identified, classified, and treated according to general scientific principles. Medical knowledge became based on anatomical dissection, clinical examination, and statistical analysis of large numbers of cases. Treatment became focused on identifying and correcting specific biological abnormalities. This was not simply a matter of medical progress or scientific advancement. Instead, it represented a complete reorganization of how people thought about life, death, knowledge, and the human body. Michel Foucault's archaeological method examines how systems of knowledge are organized within specific historical periods, revealing the underlying rules that govern what can be thought and said. The new medical discourse made certain kinds of questions thinkable while making others disappear. It created new possibilities for medical intervention while foreclosing others. Foucault used the term episteme to describe these underlying systems of knowledge. An episteme is like the unconscious grammar of thought in a particular historical period. Just as grammatical rules allow us to form meaningful sentences without being consciously aware of the rules we are following, epistemic rules allow us to form meaningful knowledge claims without being aware of the deep assumptions that govern our thinking. The concept of episteme helps explain why intellectual debates within a particular historical period often seem to miss each other completely when viewed from later perspectives. People in different epistemes are not just disagreeing about the answers to the same questions. They are asking fundamentally different questions and using fundamentally different criteria to determine what counts as a reasonable answer. Consider the famous debate between Galileo and the Catholic Church about whether the Earth revolves around the Sun. We usually understand this as a conflict between science and religion, or between reason and faith. But Foucault's archaeological approach reveals something more complex. Galileo and his opponents were operating within different epistemes that organized knowledge in fundamentally different ways. For the church authorities, knowledge had to be consistent with revealed scripture and established theological doctrine. The ultimate test of truth was correspondence with divine revelation as interpreted by proper religious authority. Physical observations were important, but they had to be understood within a larger framework of cosmic harmony and divine purpose. For Galileo, knowledge had to be based on mathematical reasoning and empirical observation. The ultimate test of truth was correspondence with what could be measured, calculated, and experimentally verified. Religious and moral considerations were important, but they belonged to a different domain than natural philosophy. These were not just different opinions about astronomy. They represented different ways of organizing all knowledge and different understandings of what it meant to know something truly. Each side was being perfectly rational according to the rules of their own episteme, but they could not really communicate with each other because they were playing by different rules. Foucault's archaeological method reveals that these kinds of epistemic shifts happen throughout history. They represent moments when the basic structure of knowledge changes in ways that create new possibilities for thought and action. But these shifts are not simply matters of intellectual progress. Each episteme creates its own forms of inclusion and exclusion, its own ways of determining what counts as legitimate knowledge and who is authorized to speak the truth. Understanding the archaeological dimension of knowledge helps us think critically about our own historical moment. What are the deep assumptions that govern how we organize knowledge in contemporary society? What kinds of questions do our current episteme make thinkable, and what kinds of questions does it foreclose? How might future archaeologists understand the unconscious rules that structure our own ways of thinking? These questions become particularly important when we consider contemporary challenges like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and climate change. Our responses to these challenges are shaped not just by our conscious beliefs and values, but also by the deep epistemic structures that determine what kinds of problems we recognize and what kinds of solutions we consider possible. Archaeological analysis gives us tools to excavate these hidden assumptions and to imagine alternative ways of organizing knowledge and addressing contemporary problems. Part 4. Tracing the Roots, the Genealogical Method and the Accident of History. Later in his career, Foucault developed another method he called genealogy, inspired by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Genealogy does not try to find the origins of ideas or trace their smooth development through history. Instead, it looks for accidents, struggles, and power conflicts that shaped how we think today. In using the term genealogy, Foucault proclaimed his connection to Nietzsche and developed a method that reveals how current ways of thinking emerged through contingent historical processes rather than inevitable progress. While archaeology shows us how different systems of knowledge work, genealogy shows us how those systems came to have power and authority. Genealogy deals with precisely the same substrata of knowledge and culture, but Foucault now describes it as a level where the grounds of the true and the false come to be distinguished via mechanisms of power. Foucault went from analyzing singular, isolable domains of practice such as knowledge to analyzing the interactions between multiple domains of practice such as power knowledge. Genealogy is like detective work that follows a very different kind of evidence than traditional history. Instead of looking for the grand narrative of progress or the steady development of ideas, genealogy looks for breaks, conflicts, and reversals. It asks not where our ideas came from, but how they managed to become dominant when other possibilities were also available. It examines not the logic of intellectual development, but the play of forces that determined which possibilities would be realized and which would be suppressed. Consider Foucault's genealogy of modern punishment in Discipline and Punish. Most people assume that we moved from harsh physical punishment to more humane imprisonment because we became more civilized and enlightened. This traditional story sees the history of punishment as a gradual progress toward more rational and humane treatment of criminals. But Foucault's genealogical analysis reveals a much more complex and troubling picture. Foucault showed that the shift from public execution to private imprisonment was not primarily motivated by humanitarian concerns. Instead, it reflected new strategies of social control that were more efficient and more total than previous methods. Public executions had become politically dangerous because they often turned into popular festivals that challenged rather than reinforced state authority. Crowds would sometimes riot in support of the condemned person, transforming the spectacle of punishment into a celebration of resistance. The new system of imprisonment solved this problem by making punishment invisible and by focusing on transforming the criminal rather than simply destroying the body. But this transformation came at the cost of creating new and more subtle forms of control that extended far beyond the prison walls. The techniques developed for managing prisoners' surveillance, normalization, examination and discipline gradually spread throughout society. Schools, hospitals, factories and other institutions began to adopt similar methods for shaping human behavior. This genealogical analysis reveals that what we consider progress often involves the creation of new problems, even as it solves old ones. The move away from physical punishment solved the problem of popular disorder, but it created the problem of pervasive social discipline. It eliminated the spectacular violence of public execution, but it introduced the subtle violence of normalization and surveillance. Genealogy shows us that historical change is not driven by abstract forces like reason, progress, or the march of civilization. Instead, it is driven by very concrete struggles between different groups with different interests and different visions of how society should be organized. The outcome of these struggles is never predetermined. It depends on particular circumstances, strategic choices, and accidents of timing and context. This has profound implications for how we understand our contemporary situation. If our current ways of thinking and living emerge through contingent historical processes, then they are not natural or inevitable. They could have been different and they can still be changed. But change requires understanding the specific forces and mechanisms that maintain current arrangements. It requires genealogical analysis that reveals how apparently natural and necessary features of our world are actually the products of particular historical struggles. Foucault's genealogy of sexuality provides another example of this method. Most people assume that Western society repressed sexuality from the 17th to the 20th centuries, and that sexual liberation represents progress toward greater freedom and authenticity. But Foucault's genealogical analysis in the history of sexuality reveals that modern Western society actually created more discourse about sex, not less. The apparent repression of sexuality was accompanied by an explosion of talk about sex in medical, psychological, pedagogical and legal contexts. This proliferation of sexual discourse did not represent liberation from repression. Instead, it represented new strategies of power that worked by inciting people to speak about their sexuality rather than by silencing them. Modern power discovered that it could control people more effectively by encouraging them to examine their desires, confess their secrets, and seek expert help in understanding their true sexual nature. The genealogical method reveals that the categories we use to understand ourselves, like sexuality, mental health, criminality, and normality, are not natural facts about human nature. Instead, they are historical constructions that emerged through particular struggles and conflicts. They reflect the victory of certain ways of thinking over other possibilities that were also available. But genealogy is not simply a negative or destructive method. By showing us how our current arrangements came to be, it also opens up space for imagining how they might be different. If the present is the product of contingent historical processes, then alternative futures are also possible. Genealogy provides tools for thinking critically about what we take for granted, and for envisioning different ways of organizing human life. This is why Foucault's genealogical method has been so influential in contemporary social movements. Feminists have used genealogical analysis to show how gender categories emerged through historical struggles and how they might be reorganized. Anti-racist activists have used genealogical methods to reveal how racial categories were constructed through particular historical processes and how they continue to operate today. LGBTQ activists have used genealogical approaches to challenge naturalized assumptions about sexuality and gender identity. In each case, genealogical analysis serves not just to understand the past, but to create possibilities for different futures. It shows that what seems most natural and permanent about human arrangements is actually the product of particular historical forces that can be understood, criticized, and potentially changed. This makes genealogy not just an intellectual method, but a tool for political and ethical transformation. Part 5. The disciplined body and soul, how modern society creates docile subjects. One of Foucault's most influential discoveries was about how modern societies control people through what he called disciplinary power. He argued that sometime around the 18th century, Western societies underwent a fundamental transformation in how they exercised power over individuals. We moved from societies that primarily used physical force and spectacular punishment to societies that shape behavior through subtle surveillance, normalization, and training. This transformation created what Foucault called disciplinary society, a form of social organization based on the systematic production of docile and productive subjects. Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, published in 1975, contains his most famous and elaborate exposition of disciplinary power. But disciplinary power extends far beyond prisons to include schools, hospitals, factories, military barracks, and many other modern institutions. From roughly 1973 to 1976, in analyses of punishment, proto-psychiatry, criminology, and race war, Foucault attempted to articulate disciplinary power in contradistinction to sovereign power. In the past, when someone broke the law, they were often punished in public with physical violence designed to demonstrate the awesome power of the sovereign. Public executions, torture, and brutal corporal punishment served as spectacles that reinforced social hierarchy and deterred potential lawbreakers through fear. But this system of sovereign power had significant limitations. It was expensive, inefficient, and often counterproductive because public punishments could become occasions for popular resistance rather than displays of authority. Starting around the 18th century, a new form of power began to emerge that worked not by destroying the body, but by training and transforming it. During the classical period, there was a rapid development of various disciplines: universities, secondary schools, barracks, workshops. This disciplinary power focused on creating what Foucault called docile bodies, individuals who were skilled, productive, and obedient. Disciplinary power produces docile bodies through disciplinary sites such as schools, prisons, and hospitals, which can be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. Think about how a modern school works and compare it to how children were educated in earlier periods. In traditional education, students might gather around a single teacher who would lecture or lead discussions. Learning was often based on memorization and repetition, and discipline was maintained through physical punishment when necessary. But modern schools are organized very differently. Students are arranged in rows of individual desks, all facing the teacher and the blackboard. They follow strict schedules that divide time into precise units for different subjects. They are constantly observed, examined, and evaluated according to standardized criteria. Their behavior is regulated through detailed rules about when they can speak, move, or leave their seats. They are sorted into grades and tracks based on their measured abilities and performance. This system does much more than simply transmit knowledge from teachers to students. It creates a particular kind of human being, someone who is accustomed to being watched, measured and ranked. Someone who internalizes the need for constant self-monitoring and self-improvement. Someone who accepts that their value as a person depends on their performance according to external standards. Someone who learns to compete with others while conforming to institutional expectations. The same disciplinary techniques appear throughout modern society. Factories organize workers into standardized procedures and monitor their productivity through time and motion studies. Hospitals organize patients into diagnostic categories and treat them according to standardized protocols. Military organizations use drill, inspection and training to create soldiers who respond automatically to commands. Office buildings use open floor plans and performance metrics to ensure that employees remain focused and productive. But disciplinary power works most effectively when people internalize its requirements and begin to monitor themselves. The most efficient form of control is when people control themselves without even realizing they are doing it. Foucault illustrated this principle through his analysis of the panopticon, an ideal prison designed by the 18th century philosopher Jeremy Bentham. The panopticon was designed as a circular building with cells around the perimeter and a guard tower in the center. The brilliant feature of this design was that prisoners could always be observed by guards, but they could never know whether they were actually being watched at any particular moment. This uncertainty meant that prisoners had to assume they were always under surveillance and modify their behavior accordingly. Eventually they would internalize the gaze of the guard and begin to monitor their own behavior even when no external surveillance was present. They would become, in effect, their own guards. Foucault argued that modern society operates according to a generalized panoptic principle. We live in a world where we might always be observed, measured and judged by authorities whose standards we have internalized. We carry within ourselves the watchful gaze that monitors our appearance, our performance, our conformity to social norms. We become anxious about our weight, our grades, our productivity, our social media presence because we have internalized the disciplinary mechanisms that constantly evaluate and rank us. This creates what Foucault called normalization, a process by which certain ways of being are established as normal and healthy, while others are marked as deviant or pathological. Disciplinary power does not work primarily through prohibition and punishment. Instead, it works by establishing norms and encouraging people to conform to them through constant examination and comparison with others. People who deviate from the norm are not necessarily punished, but they are identified, studied and subject to corrective interventions designed to bring them back into conformity. Think about how contemporary society deals with mental health, learning disabilities, or behavioral problems in children. Children who have difficulty sitting still, following instructions, or concentrating in school are identified through systematic observation and testing. They are diagnosed with conditions like ADHD or learning disorders and subject to medical, psychological or educational interventions designed to normalize their behavior. The goal is not to punish them, but to help them become more successful according to standard institutional expectations. But this process of normalization has profound effects on how we understand ourselves and our possibilities. It creates categories of normal and abnormal that shape not only how institutions treat us, but how we think about our own identity and potential. It establishes standards of health, intelligence, productivity and social adjustment that become the criteria by which we judge our own worth and the worth of others. It creates what Foucault called disciplinary society, a form of social organization where power operates primarily through the production of knowledge about individuals and the establishment of norms that guide their development. Part 6. Biopower, the politics of life itself and the management of populations. Perhaps Foucault's most important concept for understanding modern society is biopower, a form of power that emerged in the 18th century and fundamentally transformed how societies are organized and governed. Foucault traces the shift from classical, juridico-legal or sovereign power to two typically modern forms of power, discipline and biopower, as a shift from a right of death to a power over life. This represents one of the most significant transformations in human history, the moment when political power became primarily concerned not with taking life, but with fostering, managing and optimizing life. Biopower encompasses both the discipline of individual bodies and the regulation of entire populations, focusing on managing life processes at both personal and social levels. Unlike sovereign power, which manifested itself through spectacular displays of violence and the threat of death, biopower operates through care, improvement and the promise of better life. The right of sovereignty was the right to take life or let live. And then this new right is established, the right to make live and to let die. Instead of saying you must not do this or you will die, biopower says you should do this so you can live better. This transformation represents a fundamental change in how power operates in modern societies. Biopower is primarily a power of care aimed at strengthening and enhancing life, but it also involves processes of inclusion and exclusion that determine which lives are considered valuable. Think about how contemporary governments approach public health, education, social welfare and economic development. These are all examples of biopower in action, political interventions designed to optimize the health, productivity and well-being of populations. But biopower operates at two distinct but related levels that Foucault called anatomopolitics and biopolitics. Anatomopolitics focuses on individual human bodies, seeking to maximize their capabilities while ensuring their docility and usefulness. This is the disciplinary dimension of biopower that we discussed in the previous section, the training, surveillance and normalization of individual subjects. Biopolitics, on the other hand, focuses on populations as biological and social entities, seeking to manage birth rates, death rates, health statistics, and other phenomena that affect the overall welfare of the social body. Consider how modern states collect and analyze demographic data about their populations. They track birth rates and death rates, disease patterns and life expectancy, educational attainment and economic productivity. They develop policies to encourage or discourage certain kinds of behavior based on their effects on population health and welfare. They create public health campaigns to reduce smoking, encourage exercise, promote safe sex and prevent disease. They design educational systems to develop human capital and economic policies to maximize national competitiveness. All of these activities represent the operation of biopower at the level of population management. They reflect a form of political rationality that sees the health and productivity of the population as the primary responsibility of government. This is a radical departure from earlier forms of political power that were primarily concerned with maintaining sovereignty and collecting tribute. Modern states justify their authority not by claiming divine right or traditional legitimacy, but by promising to improve the lives of their citizens. But this caring power also creates new forms of control and exclusion. When the state claims responsibility for the health and welfare of the population, it also claims the right to determine what counts as healthy and productive behavior. It develops expertise about human nature and social organization that becomes the basis for increasingly detailed interventions in everyday life. It creates categories of normal and abnormal, healthy and pathological, productive and unproductive that shape how individuals understand themselves and their possibilities. Biopower also creates what Foucault called biopolitical racism. Mechanisms for dividing populations into groups that deserve care and investment versus groups that can be abandoned or eliminated. For Foucault, biopolitical racism is an expression of a schism within society that is provoked by the idea of an ongoing and always incomplete cleansing of the social body. This is not necessarily racism in the traditional sense of prejudice based on skin color or ethnicity. Instead, it is a form of governmental rationality that divides populations according to their perceived contribution to social health and productivity. Think about how contemporary societies treat different groups of people in relation to healthcare, education, employment and social services. Some groups are seen as valuable investments that deserve extensive care and support. Others are seen as drains on social resources that should be managed, contained or eliminated. The elderly, the disabled, the unemployed, immigrants and other marginalized groups often find themselves subject to forms of biopower that involve abandonment rather than care. This dynamic becomes particularly visible in discussions about healthcare policy, social welfare and immigration. Debates about these issues often focus on questions of cost and benefit, efficiency and productivity, investment and return. They involve calculations about which lives are worth saving and which groups deserve support. They reflect the operation of a biopolitical rationality that treats human life as a resource to be managed rather than as an end in itself. Foucault argued that biopower has become an indispensable element in the development of capitalism and modern economic systems. Capitalism requires not just the disciplined bodies that can work efficiently in factories and offices, but also healthy populations that can serve as both productive workers and active consumers. It needs educational systems that develop human capital, healthcare systems that maintain workforce health, and social policies that manage unemployment and social unrest. Biopower provides the mechanisms through which modern states create the kinds of subjects that capitalist economies require. But biopower also creates new possibilities for resistance and political action. When life itself becomes the object of political power, struggles over health, sexuality, environment and social welfare become central to political conflict. Contemporary social movements often focus on biopower issues, demanding better healthcare, challenging environmental destruction, fighting for reproductive rights, advocating for disability rights. These movements represent new forms of political resistance that emerge from the contradictions and exclusions of biopolitical governance. Understanding biopower helps us make sense of many contemporary political developments. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, revealed the extent to which modern states rely on biopolitical mechanisms of population management. Public health measures like lockdowns, mask mandates and vaccination campaigns represent classic examples of biopower in action. But they also reveal the limits and contradictions of biopolitical governance, as different groups were affected very differently by both the disease and the measures taken to control it. Similarly, debates about immigration, healthcare, education and social welfare can all be understood as struggles over the operation of biopower in contemporary societies. These debates involve fundamental questions about who belongs to the political community, what kinds of life deserve support and protection, and how societies should manage the health and welfare of their populations. Understanding biopower gives us tools to think critically about these issues and to imagine alternative forms of political organization that might be more inclusive and just. Part 7. Governmentality, the art of guiding conduct and shaping freedom. Connected to biopower is what Foucault called governmentality, one of his most influential and complex concepts for understanding how power operates in contemporary societies. Government becomes Foucault's preferred term for power, while governmentality functions as his main theoretical tool for analysing its rationality, techniques and procedures in the modern world. Governmentality is not just about governments in the political sense. It encompasses all the ways that the conduct of individuals and groups is guided, shaped, and directed at every level of social life. Foucault originally used the term governmentality to describe a particular way of administering populations in modern European history within the context of the rise of the idea of the state. But he later expanded his definition to encompass the techniques and procedures which are designed to govern the conduct of both individuals and populations at every level, not just the administrative or political level. This includes the notion of self-government, the ways that people learn to govern their own conduct according to particular norms and objectives. Foucault shows that while government historically referred to a wide range of practices from religious guidance of the soul to ruling over a territory and its inhabitants, in the context of the modern state it has come to mean governing a population. But governing a population is a much more complex task than simply ruling over subjects or managing territory. It requires detailed knowledge about how populations behave, what motivates them, and how they can be influenced to act in desired ways. It involves creating the conditions under which people will freely choose to behave in ways that serve broader social and economic objectives. This is where governmentality becomes particularly sophisticated and subtle. Rather than operating solely, or even primarily through coercion and regulation, biopolitics constituted the basis of liberalism as an art of governmentality that recognized freedom itself as a crucial terrain of rule. The most effective forms of modern power work not by forcing people to do things against their will, but by shaping their desires, aspirations, and understanding of their own interests. Modern power works by producing the kinds of subjects who will freely choose to behave in ways that serve the needs of the larger system. Think about how we are encouraged to take care of our health in contemporary society. Nobody forces us to exercise, eat healthy food, avoid smoking, or get regular medical checkups. We are not punished by law for being overweight, sedentary, or unhealthy. Instead, we are constantly surrounded by messages about what healthy, responsible, successful people do. We are provided with information about the risks of various behaviors and the benefits of healthy lifestyles. We are encouraged to monitor our own bodies, track our progress, and take responsibility for our own health outcomes. This represents a form of governmental power that works through freedom rather than against it. We experience ourselves as free agents making individual choices about our lifestyle and health. But these choices are made within a framework of knowledge, norms, and incentives that has been carefully constructed to guide us towards certain kinds of behavior. We govern ourselves according to standards and objectives that we have internalized, but that ultimately serve broader social and economic goals. Foucault's analysis of governmentality reveals how modern power operates through the management of populations and the formation of subjects who govern themselves. This form of power is particularly characteristic of liberal and neoliberal forms of governance that emphasize individual freedom and responsibility. Liberal governmentality does not seek to control people directly through commands and prohibitions. Instead, it seeks to create the conditions under which people will govern themselves in appropriate ways. Consider how contemporary societies approach problems like unemployment, crime, or educational failure. Instead of simply punishing people for being unemployed or criminal or poorly educated, modern societies typically focus on changing the conditions and incentives that shape individual behavior. They provide job training programs to help unemployed people develop marketable skills. They create community policing programs to address the social conditions that contribute to crime. They develop educational interventions to help struggling students improve their performance. All of these approaches reflect a governmental rationality that sees social problems as the result of individual deficits that can be addressed through appropriate interventions. They assume that people want to be productive, law-abiding and successful, but lack the knowledge, skills or opportunities to achieve these goals. The solution is not to coerce people, but to provide them with the resources and incentives they need to govern themselves more effectively. This approach appears humane and empowering because it emphasizes individual agency and choice. But governmental power also has exclusionary and disciplinary effects. People who fail to govern themselves according to appropriate norms may find themselves subject to more coercive interventions. The unemployed person who does not actively seek work may lose social benefits. The parent whose children are not performing well in school may be investigated by social services. The patient who does not comply with medical advice may be denied certain forms of treatment. Governmentality also shapes how we understand ourselves as subjects. We learn to think of ourselves as individuals who are responsible for our own success or failure. We internalize the need to constantly work on ourselves, to improve our skills, optimize our health, enhance our productivity, manage our relationships. We become what Foucault called entrepreneurial subjects, people who treat themselves as a form of human capital that must be continuously developed and marketed. Foucault's account of neoliberalism demonstrates how contemporary governmentality operates through the promotion of individual responsibility and self-management. Neoliberalism does not simply promote free markets and reduce government intervention. Instead, it creates new forms of governmental intervention designed to produce the kinds of subjects that market economies require. It encourages people to think of themselves as entrepreneurs who must compete in markets for jobs, housing, education and healthcare. It promotes individual responsibility while reducing collective forms of social support and solidarity. Understanding governmentality helps us recognize the subtle but powerful ways that contemporary power operates through our own desires and aspirations. The paradox of modern power is that it works by promoting freedom, but only certain kinds of freedom that fit within acceptable limits. We are free to choose, but our choices are structured by governmental mechanisms that shape what we desire, what we consider possible, and how we understand our own interests. This makes contemporary power both more effective and more difficult to resist than earlier forms of domination that operated primarily through coercion and prohibition. But understanding governmentality also provides tools for thinking about resistance and alternative possibilities. If contemporary subjects are produced through specific governmental techniques, then different techniques might produce different kinds of subjects. If our current forms of freedom are shaped by particular governmental rationalities, then different rationalities might create different forms of freedom. This opens up space for imagining and creating alternative ways of organizing social life that might be more genuinely liberating and inclusive. Part 8. Sexuality and Subjectification: How we became sexual beings through confession and control. One of Foucault's most famous and controversial works examined how Western society came to understand sexuality, not as a natural biological drive, but as a central component of human identity that must be constantly examined, understood and managed. The publication of Michel Foucault's Les Aveux de la Chair, History of Sexuality, Volume 4, Confessions of the Flesh, 34 years after his death, highlights the relevance of his genealogical analyses of subjectivity and sexual ethics. His argument fundamentally challenged the common belief that sexuality was simply repressed by conservative social forces and then liberated through progressive social movements. Instead, Foucault argued that modern Western societies actually created more discourse about sex, not less. But this proliferation of sexual discourse was not a sign of liberation from repression. Instead, it represented new strategies of power that worked by inciting people to speak about their sexuality rather than by silencing them. Modern power discovered that it could control people more effectively by encouraging them to examine their desires, confess their secrets, and seek expert guidance in understanding their true sexual nature. The key insight is that sexuality, as we understand it today, is not a natural biological drive that was always there waiting to be discovered or liberated. Instead, sexuality is a way of organizing thoughts, feelings and behaviors that was created through specific historical processes involving the interaction of power, knowledge and subjectification. The notion that every individual has a sexuality, a deep inner truth about their desires that defines who they are, is a relatively recent historical development. Before the 18th century, people certainly engaged in sexual activities, but they did not think of themselves as having a sexuality in the modern sense. Think about how we are encouraged to discover our true sexual identity in contemporary society. We are told that deep inside us lies our authentic sexual self, and that we should explore it, understand it, and express it. We are encouraged to reflect on our earliest sexual experiences, analyze our fantasies and desires, and seek professional help if we are confused about our sexual orientation or satisfaction. We are expected to be able to articulate our sexual preferences, communicate them to partners, and work to improve our sexual relationships. This creates what Foucault called the sexual subject, a new kind of person who must constantly examine their own desires and define themselves in sexual terms. The sexual subject is someone who believes that their sexuality reveals something essential about their identity, and that understanding their sexuality is crucial to living an authentic and fulfilling life. This is a very different way of thinking about sexuality than existed in earlier historical periods. In medieval Christianity, for example, sexual desire was generally seen as a temptation to be resisted rather than as a core component of personal identity to be explored and expressed. Foucault traced the emergence of the sexual subject through what he called the deployment of sexuality, a complex system of discourses, institutions and practices that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries. This deployment involved several key elements: the historization of women's bodies, the pedagogization of children's sex, the socialization of procreative behavior, and the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. Each of these processes contributed to the creation of new categories of sexual identity and new forms of sexual knowledge. The historization of women's bodies involved the medicalization of women's sexuality and reproductive capacity. Women came to be understood as fundamentally sexual beings, whose physical and mental health was determined by the proper functioning of their reproductive organs. This created new forms of medical expertise about female sexuality and new possibilities for medical intervention in women's lives. It also established the idea that women's sexuality was both central to their identity and inherently pathological, requiring constant medical supervision and management. The pedagogization of children's sex involved the emergence of new forms of knowledge and concern about childhood sexuality. Children came to be understood as naturally sexual beings, whose sexual development needed to be carefully monitored and guided. This created new forms of educational and medical expertise about child development and new anxieties about sexual abuse, masturbation, and other forms of inappropriate sexual behavior in children. It established the idea that proper sexual development in childhood was crucial to adult health and social functioning. The socialization of procreative behavior involved new forms of state and medical concern about birth rates, marriage patterns, and family formation. Sexual behavior came to be understood not just as a private matter between individuals, but as a social phenomenon that affected the health and welfare of entire populations. This created new forms of demographic knowledge and new policies aimed at encouraging or discouraging particular forms of reproductive behavior. It established the idea that sexual behavior should be guided not just by personal desire or moral principles, but by social responsibility and scientific knowledge. The psychiatrization of perverse pleasure involved the creation of new categories of sexual deviance and new forms of medical treatment for sexual disorders. Sexual behaviors that deviated from reproductive heterosexual norms came to be understood as symptoms of mental illness rather than as moral failings or criminal behaviors. This created new forms of psychiatric expertise about sexual pathology and new possibilities for medical intervention in the lives of sexual minorities. It established the idea that sexual desire could be classified, diagnosed and treated according to scientific criteria. All of these processes involved what Foucault called the incitement to discourse. The creation of social pressure and institutional mechanisms that encourage people to speak about their sexuality. Rather than silencing sexual discourse, modern power created numerous contexts in which people were expected or required to confess their sexual thoughts, experiences, and desires. Medical consultations, psychological therapy, pedagogical relationships, and legal proceedings all became occasions for sexual confession. People were encouraged to examine their own sexual behavior and to seek expert help in understanding and improving their sexual lives. This process of sexual confession created new forms of knowledge about sexuality, while also creating new possibilities for controlling sexual subjects. When we confess our sexual thoughts to therapists, when we read books about sexual techniques, when we worry about whether our desires are normal, we are participating in systems of knowledge and power that shape who we become. We are not simply expressing our natural sexuality. We are constituting ourselves as sexual subjects according to particular norms and expectations. We are learning to understand ourselves through categories and concepts that have been developed by experts and institutionalized through various social practices. But Foucault's analysis of sexuality was not simply critical or negative. He also recognized that the deployment of sexuality created new possibilities for resistance and alternative forms of life. Sexual minority communities have used the very categories and concepts that were originally designed to pathologize them as resources for building positive identities and political movements. The idea that sexuality is central to personal identity, which was originally a mechanism of control, has also become a basis for claims to rights, recognition, and social inclusion. Understanding the genealogy of sexuality helps us think critically about contemporary sexual politics and culture. It reveals that many of the categories and assumptions we take for granted about sexuality are actually historical constructions that could be different. It shows that sexual liberation movements, while challenging specific forms of sexual repression, often reproduce deeper assumptions about the centrality of sexuality to human identity. It suggests that truly radical sexual politics might require not just fighting for sexual freedom, but questioning the entire framework through which we understand sexuality and its relationship to selfhood. Part 9. Madness and Reason, the Great Confinement and the Birth of Mental Illness. Foucault's first major work, History of Madness in the Classical Age, originated in his academic study of psychology and his work in a Parisian mental hospital, combined with his own personal psychological struggles. This groundbreaking study revealed how what we today call mental illness is not a timeless medical condition, but a historically specific way of understanding and managing certain forms of human experience. Through meticulous historical research, Foucault showed that the boundary between reason and madness has been drawn differently in different historical periods, and that these differences reflect broader transformations in how societies understand knowledge, order, and human nature. In the medieval and Renaissance periods, mad people occupied a very different place in society than they do today. Madness was often understood as a form of divine inspiration or punishment, and mad people were sometimes revered as holy fools who had access to spiritual truths unavailable to ordinary rational beings. They were typically cared for by their families or communities, and were often allowed to wander freely, even across national boundaries. The famous Ship of Fools that appears in medieval literature and art was not just a literary metaphor, but reflected the actual practice of loading mad people onto boats and sending them away to become someone else's responsibility. But this was not simply cruel abandonment. The practice of expelling mad people from communities while allowing them to wander freely reflected a particular understanding of madness as a form of otherness that was both threatening and sacred. Mad people were excluded from normal social life, but they were not imprisoned or subjected to systematic medical intervention. They existed in what Foucault called a liminal space, neither fully inside nor completely outside the social order. This began to change dramatically in the 17th century, with what Foucault called the Great Confinement. Starting around 1650, European societies began systematically confining mad people, along with criminals, vagrants, and other social undesirables, in large institutions. In France, this process was symbolized by the creation of the Hôpital General in Paris, which housed thousands of people who were considered undesirable or dangerous. But this was not yet a medical institution in the modern sense. It was more like a combination prison, workhouse, and moral reform institution. The Great Confinement reflected a fundamental shift in how European societies understood social order and individual responsibility. During the Classical Age, madness came to be seen not as divine inspiration or natural misfortune, but as moral failing or social disorder. Mad people were confined not primarily because they were sick, but because they violated the emerging bourgeois values of reason, productivity, and social discipline. They represented a form of unreason that threatened the rational organization of social life. Foucault showed that this classical understanding of madness was organized around moral and social categories rather than medical ones. Mad people were confined along with other groups who were seen as failing to fulfill their social obligations: the unemployed, the dissolute, the criminal, the sexually immoral. The goal of confinement was not cure, but containment and moral reform. Mad people were expected to work, to follow institutional discipline, and to demonstrate their worthiness through proper behaviour. But around the end of the 18th century, another fundamental transformation began. Mad people began to be separated from other confined populations and subjected to specifically medical forms of knowledge and intervention. This was the birth of modern psychiatry and the emergence of what we now call mental illness. Figures like Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England pioneered new approaches to madness that emphasized medical treatment rather than moral discipline. This transformation is often celebrated as a humanitarian advance. The liberation of mad people from the harsh conditions of the old confinement institutions and their treatment as medical patients deserving of care rather than punishment. But Foucault's genealogical analysis reveals that this medical transformation created new forms of power and control that were in some ways more total than what came before. The mad person was no longer simply excluded from society or subjected to moral discipline. Instead, they became the object of scientific knowledge and medical intervention that claimed to understand the deepest truth about their condition and identity. The medicalization of madness created what Foucault called the psychiatric gaze, a form of medical observation that claimed to see through external symptoms to the underlying pathological processes that caused mental illness. This gaze constituted mad people as patients whose subjectivity was fundamentally shaped by their illness. Unlike the classical confinement, which treated madness as moral failing that could potentially be corrected, medical psychiatry treated madness as an objective condition that defined the patient's essential nature. The mad person became a madman or madwoman, someone whose identity was fundamentally constituted by their pathological condition. This medical transformation also created new forms of psychiatric expertise and institutional power. Psychiatrists claimed scientific authority over madness and developed increasingly elaborate systems of classification, diagnosis, and treatment. Mental hospitals became spaces where psychiatric knowledge was produced and refined through the systematic observation and treatment of patients. Mad people became objects of scientific research, whose symptoms and responses to treatment provided data for the development of psychiatric theory and practice. But Foucault's analysis revealed that psychiatric knowledge was not simply objective scientific truth about mental illness. Instead, it was a particular way of organizing and understanding human experience that reflected specific historical, social, and political conditions. The categories of mental illness that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, hysteria, neurasthenia, schizophrenia, depression, were not discoveries of pre-existing natural conditions, but historical constructions that shaped how people experienced and understood their own psychological distress. This has profound implications for how we understand contemporary mental health practices. Foucault was not arguing that psychological suffering is not real or that people do not need help with mental health problems. Instead, he was showing that the ways we understand and respond to psychological distress are historically contingent and could be different. Our current systems of psychiatric diagnosis, pharmaceutical treatment and therapeutic intervention represent one possible approach to human psychological diversity and suffering, but not the only possible approach. Foucault's genealogy of madness also reveals how the boundary between reason and unreason has been used to exclude certain forms of human experience from legitimate social participation. The category of mental illness has often been used to delegitimize the experiences and perspectives of people who challenge dominant social norms or who experience the world in unconventional ways. Women, racial minorities, sexual minorities, and political dissidents have all been disproportionately subjected to psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. This suggests that mental illness categories are not simply medical, but also political, serving to maintain existing power relations by pathologizing forms of difference and resistance. Understanding the history of madness helps us think more critically about contemporary mental health practices and policies. It reveals that many of the categories and assumptions we take for granted about mental illness are actually historical constructions that reflect particular social and political arrangements. It suggests that alternative approaches to psychological diversity and distress might be possible, and that current mental health systems might benefit from more critical reflection on their historical origins and social functions. Most importantly, it reminds us that the line between reason and unreason is not fixed by nature, but is constantly being redrawn through social and political processes that deserve critical examination. Part 10. Ancient Ethics and Care of the Self, the Art of Beautiful Existence. In his later work, Foucault turned to ancient Greek and Roman philosophy to explore fundamentally different ways of thinking about ethics, subjectivity, and the relationship between self and society. These treatments of ancient sexuality moved Foucault into ethical issues that had been implicit but seldom explicitly thematized in his earlier writings. He discovered that ancient peoples had developed sophisticated approaches to ethics that were not based on universal moral rules or divine commands, but on the cultivation of specific relationships between individuals and themselves. This investigation revealed possibilities for ethical life that had been largely forgotten in Christian and modern moral philosophy. Foucault defines ethics as a relation of self to itself in terms of its moral agency. More specifically, ethics denotes the intentional work of an individual on itself in order to subject itself to a set of moral recommendations for conduct. This is a very different understanding of ethics than what most people are familiar with today. Modern ethics typically focuses on determining the right rules for behavior, what actions are permissible or prohibited, what duties we have to others, what consequences we should aim to produce. Ancient ethics, by contrast, was primarily concerned with what kind of person one should become and what practices one should undertake to transform oneself into that kind of person. The precept to be concerned with oneself was, for the Greeks, one of the main principles of cities, one of the main rules for social and personal conduct. This care of the self was not selfish individualism or narcissistic self-absorption. Instead, it was understood as a fundamental ethical and political responsibility. The idea was that people who did not know how to govern themselves properly could not participate responsibly in governing others or contributing to the common good. Self-care was thus a prerequisite for social and political engagement, rather than an alternative to it. Ancient Greek and Roman cultures developed elaborate practices and techniques for this ethical self-cultivation. They emphasized the proper use of pleasures, where this involved engaging in a range of activities including sexual activities, heterosexual, homosexual, in marriage, out of marriage, but with proper moderation. The goal was not to follow strict rules about what was forbidden, but to develop the kind of character that would naturally choose what was good and beautiful. This required constant attention to oneself, careful self-examination, and ongoing work to align one's desires and actions with one's deepest values and aspirations. Foucault contrasted this ancient approach with both Christian and modern ethics. Foucault's specific goal was to compare ancient pagan and Christian ethics through the test case of sexuality, and to trace the development of Christian ideas about sex from the very different ideas of the ancients. He argued that, contrary to what is often believed on the level of moral codes of behaviour, there are striking similarities between antiquity and Christianity. Both shared, for example, a concern that sexual expenditure could harm an individual's health, and they both valued conjugal fidelity and sexual abstinence. But there was a strong contrast in the ways these two cultures understood and practiced these ideals and demands. In the Christian view, sexual acts were, on the whole, evil in themselves, and most forms of sexual activity were simply forbidden. Ancient ethics, by contrast, did not focus on prohibiting specific acts, but on developing the proper relationship to one's own desires and pleasures. The question was not whether a particular act was intrinsically good or bad, but whether it was performed in the right way, at the right time, with the right person, and in accordance with proper moderation and self-mastery. This difference reflected deeper contrasts in how the two cultures understood the self and its relationship to truth and authority. Christian ethics was based on obedience to divine law as revealed in Scripture and interpreted by religious authorities. The individual's task was to conform their will to God's commandments and to confess and repent when they failed to do so. Ancient ethics, by contrast, was based on the cultivation of personal wisdom and self-mastery through philosophical reflection and practical exercise. The individual's task was to develop their own capacity for ethical judgment and to create a life that was beautiful, harmonious, and worthy of admiration. Sex for the Greeks was a major part of what Foucault called an aesthetics of existence, the self's creation of a beautiful and enjoyable existence. Ethics became a kind of art, the art of shaping one's own life into something worthy and beautiful. This involved what Foucault called stylization, the development of distinctive personal approaches to common ethical challenges. Just as artists develop distinctive styles that make their work recognizable and admirable, ethical individuals were expected to develop distinctive approaches to living that reflected their own character and circumstances while exemplifying broader virtues and ideals. The aesthetics of existence involved several key elements that Foucault analysed in detail. First, there was ethical substance, the part of oneself that was taken as the relevant domain for ethical judgment and transformation. For the Greeks, this was typically one's desires, pleasures and passions rather than one's acts or intentions. The goal was not to eliminate desire, but to develop the right relationship to it, to become someone who could enjoy pleasures without being enslaved by them. Second, there was the mode of subjectification, the way individuals were called upon to recognize their moral obligations and to see themselves as ethical subjects. For the Greeks, this typically involved recognizing oneself as a free person who was capable of self-mastery and responsible for one's own character development. This was very different from Christian subjectification, which involved recognizing oneself as a sinner who was dependent on divine grace for salvation. Greek ethical subjectification emphasized human capacity and responsibility rather than human limitation and dependence. Third, there was ethical work, the specific practices and techniques that individuals used to transform themselves into ethical subjects. The Greeks developed sophisticated methods for this ethical self-cultivation, including daily self-examination, philosophical meditation, dietary and exercise regimens, and various forms of spiritual discipline. These practices were understood not as burdens or punishments, but as means of developing human capacities and creating more fulfilling forms of life. They were pursued not because they were required by external authority, but because they contributed to human flourishing and excellence. Fourth, there was the telos, or goal of ethical activity, the kind of person one hoped to become through ethical practice. For the Greeks, this was typically some form of wisdom, virtue, or excellence that represented the full development of human potential. The goal was not salvation in another world, but the achievement of a beautiful and harmonious life in this world. This involved becoming someone who could act wisely and effectively in social and political contexts while maintaining inner freedom and self-possession. Foucault was particularly interested in how ancient ethics understood the relationship between self-care and care for others. Care for others should not be put before the care of oneself. The care of the self is ethically prior, in that the relationship with oneself is ontologically prior. But this did not mean that ancient ethics was individualistic or antisocial. Instead, the idea was that people who had developed proper relationships with themselves would be better able to develop proper relationships with others. Self-mastery was seen as a prerequisite for effective social and political leadership. This ancient understanding of ethics offered Foucault resources for thinking about contemporary ethical and political problems. He was particularly interested in whether modern people might be able to develop new forms of ethical self-cultivation that could provide alternatives to both Christian morality and secular liberal individualism. The care of the self was not simply individual self-improvement, but involved complex relationships with teachers, friends, and the broader community. Ancient ethical practices always involved social relationships and cultural contexts that supported and guided individual ethical development. But Foucault was also aware of the limitations and exclusions of ancient ethical systems. Greek and Roman ethics were developed primarily by and for free adult males who had the leisure and resources necessary for philosophical reflection and self-cultivation. Women, slaves, and foreigners were typically excluded from full participation in ethical and political life. The beautiful lives that ancient ethics made possible were built on social foundations that involved significant forms of domination and exclusion. Nevertheless, Foucault believed that ancient ethics contained insights and possibilities that might be valuable for contemporary ethical reflection. The idea that ethics involves the cultivation of specific relationships with oneself, the emphasis on practical wisdom and personal transformation, and the understanding of ethics as an art of living all suggested alternatives to dominant contemporary approaches to moral and political life. These insights might be particularly valuable for thinking about how to create more authentic and fulfilling forms of life within contemporary conditions of power and knowledge. Part 11. Technologies of the Self. Ancient Practices for Modern Transformation. Foucault's study of ancient ethics led him to identify what he called technologies of the self, specific techniques that people use to work on themselves, to transform themselves, to create themselves as ethical subjects. Foucault refers to these self-forming activities as practices or technologies of the self, and also in the ancient sense of ascesis or ascetic practices. These are not simply abstract philosophical ideas, but concrete practices that ancient people used to shape their own character, desires and capacities in systematic ways. Understanding these technologies of the self reveals possibilities for ethical transformation that have been largely lost in modern culture, but that might be recoverable for contemporary use. The ethical work consists of the self-forming activities meant to ensure one's own subjection to a moral authority and transform oneself into an autonomous ethical agent. But this autonomy was not understood as the absence of constraint or guidance. Instead, it involved developing the capacity to govern oneself according to principles and values that one had deeply internalized through sustained practice and reflection. The goal was to become someone who naturally and spontaneously acted in accordance with ethical ideals, because those ideals had become integral to one's character and identity. Ancient philosophers developed systematic methods for this ethical self-cultivation that were remarkably sophisticated and practical. In the philosophical tradition dominated by Stoicism, ascesis means not renunciation, but the progressive consideration of self, or mastery over oneself, obtained not through the renunciation of reality, but through the acquisition and assimilation of truth. It has as its final aim not preparation for another reality, but access to the reality of this world. The Greek word for this is paraskiwazo, which means to get prepared. It is a set of practices by which one can acquire, assimilate and transform truth into a permanent principle of action. One of the most important Stoic techniques was the daily examination of conscience. This involved setting aside time each evening to review the events of the day, examining one's thoughts and actions, and reflecting on how well one had lived up to one's ethical ideals. But this was not the Christian examination of conscience, which focused on identifying sins and failures that needed to be confessed and forgiven. Instead, the Stoic examination was more like the review of a student who was trying to improve their performance or an athlete who was working to perfect their technique. The goal was to identify areas for improvement and to develop strategies for better performance in the future. Another important practice was philosophical meditation, which involved regular reflection on key principles and texts. Stoic practitioners would memorize important passages from philosophical texts and then spend time each day reflecting on their meaning and application to current circumstances. This was not simply intellectual exercise, but a form of spiritual discipline designed to internalize philosophical truths so deeply that they would spontaneously guide thought and action. The subjectivization of truth is the aim of these techniques. During the imperial period, one could not assimilate ethical principles without a theoretical framework such as science, as for example in Lucretius's De Rerum Naturae. Letter writing was another crucial technology of the self, particularly as practiced by figures like Seneca. Philosophical correspondence involved not just sharing ideas, but examining one's own thoughts and experiences through the process of writing to a friend or mentor. The act of writing forced individuals to articulate their reflections clearly and systematically, while the expectation of response from a correspondent provided external perspective and guidance. These letters often dealt with concrete practical problems: how to deal with anger, how to face illness or death, how to maintain equanimity in difficult circumstances. They showed how philosophical principles could be applied to the challenges of everyday life. Foucault was particularly interested in the Stoic practice of ascesis in the strict sense, exercises in which the subject puts himself into a situation in which he can verify whether he can confront events and use the discourse with which he is armed. It is a question of testing the preparation. Is this truth assimilated enough to become ethics so that we can behave as we must when an event presents itself? These exercises might involve deliberately placing oneself in challenging situations to test one's philosophical preparation, or imaginatively rehearsing how one would respond to various difficulties. For example, Stoics might practice poverty by living simply for a period of time, eating basic food and sleeping on hard beds, to test whether they had truly internalized the principle that external goods are not necessary for happiness. or they might practice what they called the premeditation of evils, systematically imagining how they would respond to various misfortunes in order to prepare themselves psychologically for whatever difficulties life might bring. These were not morbid or pessimistic exercises, but practical preparations for maintaining philosophical equanimity under pressure. They were designed to develop the kind of character that could remain stable and wise regardless of external circumstances. All of these practices shared certain common features that distinguished them from both Christian and modern approaches to self-improvement. First, they were understood as lifelong disciplines, rather than temporary interventions or cures. The goal was not to solve particular problems or achieve particular states, but to develop ongoing capacities for wise and virtuous living. Second, they involved the cultivation of specific relationships with oneself, rather than conformity to external rules or authorities. The practitioner was expected to develop personal wisdom and judgment rather than simply following prescribed guidelines. Third, these practices always involved social relationships and cultural contexts that supported individual development. Ancient ethical practices were typically carried out within schools, friendships, or mentoring relationships that provided guidance, encouragement, and accountability. Even when individuals practiced alone, they understood themselves as participating in broader philosophical communities with shared values and methods. The care of the self was not simply individual self-improvement, but involved complex relationships with teachers, friends, and the broader community. Fourth, ancient technologies of the self were understood as means of developing human capacities rather than correcting human deficiencies. While they certainly involved self-discipline and the modification of problematic desires and behaviors, they were fundamentally oriented toward human flourishing and excellence rather than toward the management of pathology or deviance. They assumed that human beings had the capacity for wisdom, virtue, and happiness, and that appropriate practices could help realize these capacities. This was very different from Christian approaches that emphasized human sinfulness and dependence on divine grace, and from modern therapeutic approaches that focus on treating mental health disorders or behavioral problems. Foucault believed that these ancient technologies of the self contained insights that might be valuable for contemporary ethical and political reflection. He was particularly interested in whether modern people might be able to develop new forms of ethical self-cultivation that could provide alternatives to both Christian confession and secular therapy. Contemporary culture offers many forms of self-help and personal development, but most of these are oriented toward achieving specific goals: losing weight, making money, finding relationships, reducing stress, rather than toward the kind of comprehensive character transformation that ancient ethics envisioned. Similarly, contemporary psychotherapy, while often helpful for addressing specific problems, typically focuses on treating disorders or dysfunctions rather than on cultivating positive capacities for human flourishing. Ancient technologies of the self suggest the possibility of practices that would be oriented toward the development of wisdom, courage, justice, and other virtues that contribute to both individual fulfillment and social well-being. But Foucault also recognized that ancient practices could not simply be adopted wholesale in contemporary contexts. They emerged within specific cultural and social conditions that no longer exist, and they were embedded in broader systems of power and exclusion that would be unacceptable today. The challenge is to identify what might be valuable about ancient approaches to ethical self-cultivation, while developing new practices that are appropriate for contemporary conditions and that avoid the exclusions and limitations of ancient systems. This requires creative adaptation rather than simple imitation, and it requires attention to how technologies of the self might be used to create more just and inclusive forms of social life rather than simply to enhance individual development. Understanding technologies of the self also provides tools for thinking critically about contemporary forms of subjectification and social control. If people can be shaped through specific practices and techniques, then different practices might create different kinds of subjects. This opens up possibilities for resistance to dominant forms of power and for the creation of alternative ways of being human. Technologies of the self represent one way that individuals might work to transform themselves in directions that are not completely determined by dominant social institutions and discourses. Part 12. Parrhesia, Truth-Telling Courage, and the Ethics of Fearless Speech. One of the most important concepts in Foucault's later work was parrhesia, a Greek word meaning fearless speech or truth-telling that became central to his understanding of ethics, politics, and the relationship between truth and freedom. Parrhesia signifies a form of truth-telling in which the individual speaks the truth openly to the other's face. But this was not just any kind of truth-telling. Parrhesia required courage because it meant speaking truth to power even when that truth might be dangerous or unwelcome to the person hearing it. Understanding parrhesia reveals dimensions of ancient ethics and politics that offer important resources for thinking about contemporary problems of truth, power, and resistance. Foucault's analysis of parrhesia reveals how truth-telling becomes a crucial component of ethical self-formation and political resistance. Foucault himself suggests such a connection when he argues that parrhesia, as a form of telling the truth and a way of telling the truth about oneself, is intrinsically connected with the problem of the care of the self. Taking care of oneself required the courage to face the truth about oneself and one's situation, even when that truth was uncomfortable or challenging. It also required the courage to speak that truth to others when necessary for their welfare or for the common good. But parrhesia was not simply a private ethical practice. It was also a crucial political activity that was essential to the health of democratic communities. In ancient Athens, citizens were expected to practice parrhesia in public assemblies, speaking frankly about political issues even when their opinions were unpopular or dangerous. This was seen as both a right and a responsibility of democratic citizenship. The idea was that good political decisions required access to truth, and that truth could only emerge through the free and fearless speech of citizens who were willing to risk social disapproval or political retaliation in order to say what needed to be said. Foucault identified several key characteristics that distinguish parrhesia from other forms of speech and truth-telling. First, parrhesia involves frankness. The parrhesiast says everything that he thinks without hiding anything or using rhetorical techniques to disguise or soften his message. This frankness is not simply a matter of being honest, but of being complete and direct in one's communication. The parrhesiast does not hold back parts of the truth in order to be polite or tactful, and he does not use clever language to manipulate his audience's response. Instead, he speaks as clearly and directly as possible about what he believes to be true. Second, parrhesia involves truth. The parrhesiast believes that what he is saying is true and speaks from his own conviction rather than simply repeating what others have said or what his audience wants to hear. This distinguishes parrhesia from rhetoric, which may use true or false statements strategically in order to persuade an audience. The parrhesiast is not primarily trying to persuade, but to communicate truth as he understands it, regardless of whether that truth is convenient or welcome. He speaks from personal knowledge and conviction rather than from hearsay or calculation. Third, parrhesia involves danger. The parrhesiast puts himself at risk by speaking truthfully, either because his message challenges people who have power over him or because it contradicts popular opinion. If there is no risk involved in speaking, then it is not really parrhesia. The courage required for parrhesia is not abstract bravery, but the specific willingness to accept real consequences: social disapproval, political retaliation, physical harm, in order to communicate important truths. This element of risk is what distinguishes parrhesia from safe forms of truth-telling like academic discourse or private conversation. Fourth, parrhesia involves criticism. The parrhesiast typically speaks truth that challenges, corrects, or reproaches his audience rather than simply confirming what they already believe. Parrhesia often involves pointing out flaws, mistakes, or dangers that others prefer not to acknowledge. This critical dimension is what makes parrhesia potentially valuable for both individual development and political decision-making. But it is also what makes it risky and difficult. People generally do not enjoy being criticized, even when the criticism is accurate and well-intentioned. Fifth, parrhesia involves a specific relationship between the speaker and the audience. Typically, the parrhesiast is speaking to someone who has more power than he does, or he is challenging majority opinion when he is in the minority. Parrhesia is not simply speaking truth, but speaking truth up to power or against prevailing opinion. This asymmetrical relationship is what creates the danger and the courage required for parrhesiastic speech. It is also what makes parrhesia politically significant, as a practice that can challenge dominant power relations and create space for alternative perspectives. Foucault traced the development of parrhesia through different periods of ancient history, showing how it functioned differently in political, philosophical, and religious contexts. In the classical democratic period, parrhesia was primarily a political practice associated with citizenship and public debate. Citizens who practiced parrhesia in the assembly were contributing to democratic deliberation by ensuring that all relevant perspectives were heard, even unpopular ones. This political parrhesia was understood as essential to democratic governance because it prevented rulers from becoming isolated from truth by surrounding themselves with flatterers and yes-men. In the Hellenistic period, parrhesia became more associated with philosophical practice and the relationship between teachers and students. Philosophical parrhesia involved the willingness of teachers to criticize their students directly and honestly in order to promote their intellectual and ethical development. Students, in turn, were expected to practice parrhesia by speaking honestly about their own thoughts, experiences and struggles, rather than pretending to be more advanced than they actually were. This philosophical parrhesia was understood as essential to genuine learning and personal transformation, because it prevented the self-deception and flattery that could block intellectual and ethical progress. In the early Christian period, parrhesia took on new meanings related to confession, spiritual direction, and the relationship between individuals and God. Christian parrhesia involved the willingness to speak honestly to God about one's sins and struggles and to accept spiritual direction from religious authorities, even when it involved difficult truths about oneself. But Foucault was particularly interested in earlier forms of parrhesia that were more directly connected to political and ethical practice in secular contexts. He saw these earlier forms as offering resources for thinking about how truth-telling might function in contemporary democratic societies. This brings into view a parrhesiastic care of the self that is not only an ethico-political care of the self and others, but also a concern for truth. For Foucault, this ancient practice offered a model for how individuals might resist modern forms of power and control through the cultivation of truthful speech. By developing the courage to speak truth about our own experiences and our society, we might create spaces for freedom and authentic self-creation that are not completely determined by dominant discourses and institutions. But parrhesia also presents significant challenges for contemporary application. Ancient parrhesia developed within specific cultural contexts that emphasized honor, shame, and personal relationships in ways that may not translate directly to contemporary democratic societies. Moreover, parrhesia can potentially be used to justify harmful or destructive speech that claims to be truthful but is actually motivated by prejudice, resentment, or desire for attention. The challenge is to distinguish genuine parrhesia, courageous truth-telling that serves ethical and political goods, from pseudo-parrhesia that simply uses the rhetoric of truth-telling to justify harmful or self-serving behavior. Nevertheless, Foucault believed that parrhesia contained insights that are crucial for contemporary democratic life. In societies where public discourse is increasingly dominated by spin, manipulation, and strategic communication, the ideal of fearless truth-telling offers an important alternative. In contexts where individuals are encouraged to conform to dominant norms and avoid challenging authority, the practice of parrhesia suggests the importance of cultivating courage for speaking difficult truths. And in situations where people are encouraged to focus primarily on their own private interests, parrhesiastic care of the self suggests the importance of connecting individual ethical development with broader social and political concerns. Part 13. Christian Confession and the Birth of the Modern Subject. In his later work, particularly in the posthumously published fourth volume of the History of Sexuality titled Confessions of the Flesh, Foucault explored how Christian practices of confession and spiritual direction created fundamentally new forms of subjectivity that became central to Western culture. The publication of Michel Foucault's Les Aveux de la Chair, 34 years after his death, highlights and complicates the relevance of Christian texts, notably from the 2nd through 5th centuries, to Foucault's forms of critical analysis between 1974 and 1984. This investigation revealed how Christian techniques for examining and transforming the self differed dramatically from ancient pagan practices, and how they contributed to the emergence of modern forms of subjectification, normalization, and control. What begins as suspicion towards confession as a tool of Catholic power anticipating modern psychoanalysis becomes a critical genealogy of subjectivity from Western antiquity to modernity. Foucault's analysis shows that Christian confession was not simply a religious practice, but a technology of power that created new forms of knowledge about human interiority and new possibilities for governing human conduct. Understanding how confession worked helps explain the emergence of many features of modern culture that we often take for granted: psychotherapy, social work, criminology, sexuality studies, and other practices that involve detailed examination of individual subjectivity. The Christian practice of confession differed fundamentally from ancient philosophical practices of self-examination in several crucial ways. While ancient practices like Stoic self-examination focused on evaluating one's actions and thoughts in relation to philosophical ideals, Christian confession focused on identifying and articulating the hidden movements of the soul that were seen as the source of sinful behavior. The goal was not simply to improve one's performance, but to achieve complete self-transparency and to submit one's innermost thoughts and desires to religious authority for evaluation and correction. This required developing new techniques for introspection and new vocabularies for articulating internal experiences that had previously remained private and unexamined. Early Christian monasticism developed elaborate methods for what they called the discernment of spirits, techniques for distinguishing between thoughts and desires that came from God versus those that came from the devil or from human sinfulness. This required monks to engage in constant self-monitoring and to report their internal experiences to spiritual directors who claimed expertise in interpreting the significance of different mental phenomena. The practice created new forms of spiritual authority based on claimed ability to see into the souls of others and to guide their spiritual development through detailed direction of their inner lives. It also created new forms of spiritual subjectivity based on the assumption that salvation required complete self-knowledge and submission to religious authority. When I began to study the rules, duties and prohibitions of sexuality, the interdictions and restrictions associated with it, I was concerned not simply with the acts that were permitted and forbidden, but with the feelings represented, the thoughts, the desires one might experience, the drives to seek within the self, any hidden feeling, any movement of the soul, any desire disguised under illusory forms. There is a very significant difference between interdictions about sexuality and other forms of interdiction. Unlike other interdictions, sexual interdictions are constantly connected with the obligation to tell the truth about oneself. This obligation to tell the truth about oneself became central to Christian spirituality, and eventually spread far beyond religious contexts. The task of analyzing one's sexual desire is always more important than analyzing any other kind of sin. Christian confession required individuals to examine not just their actions, but their thoughts, fantasies, dreams, and unconscious desires. They were expected to identify the subtle ways that sinful desires might disguise themselves as innocent thoughts or feelings, and to articulate these discoveries to religious authorities who could provide appropriate guidance and correction. This practice of confession created what Foucault called a hermeneutics of the self, a systematic approach to interpreting the meaning of one's own thoughts and experiences. Unlike ancient practices that focused on cultivating specific virtues or capacities, Christian confession assumed that the self was fundamentally mysterious and deceptive and required expert interpretation to understand. Individuals could not trust their own understanding of their motivations and desires, but needed to submit to religious authorities who claimed superior knowledge about the workings of the human soul. This created new forms of dependence on institutional authority and new possibilities for detailed control of individual behavior. The practice of confession also created new forms of knowledge about human interiority. As thousands of people confessed their thoughts and experiences to religious authorities over many centuries, Christian institutions accumulated vast amounts of information about human psychology, sexuality, and social behavior. This knowledge was systematized in theological treatises, spiritual manuals and pastoral guidance that provided increasingly detailed maps of human inner experience. These Christian discourses about human nature became foundational for later developments in psychology, psychiatry, criminology, and other human sciences. But confession was not simply a matter of providing information to religious authorities. It was also understood as a transformative practice that changed the person who engaged in it. The act of putting one's inner experience into words was believed to have purifying and healing effects, even apart from any advice or intervention that might follow. This gave confession a quasi-magical character. It was not simply communication, but a ritual that was believed to have direct effects on the soul of the person confessing. This transformative dimension of confession became particularly important in later developments. Modern psychotherapy, social work, and other helping professions inherited from Christianity the assumption that talking about one's problems and experiences has intrinsic therapeutic value. The practice of encouraging people to speak about their difficulties, to examine their motivations, and to seek expert interpretation of their experiences became central to many modern institutions. But these modern practices also inherited some of the problematic aspects of Christian confession, the assumption that individuals cannot understand themselves without expert help, the emphasis on identifying pathology and deviance, and the creation of new forms of dependence on institutional authority. Foucault was particularly interested in how Christian confession contributed to the emergence of modern sexuality as a central component of personal identity. Christian examination of conscience was particularly focused on sexual thoughts and desires, which were seen as especially dangerous and difficult to control. This created detailed discourses about sexual experience and elaborate techniques for managing sexual desire that went far beyond anything that existed in ancient cultures. Christians developed sophisticated methods for identifying, categorizing, and responding to different forms of sexual temptation that became foundational for later medical and psychological approaches to sexuality. But the Christian focus on sexuality also created new possibilities for sexual subjectification. By encouraging people to examine their sexual thoughts and desires in minute detail, confession actually intensified sexual self-consciousness and created new forms of sexual identity. People learned to understand themselves as fundamentally sexual beings whose inner lives were dominated by sexual concerns, even when they were trying to achieve sexual purity. This paradoxical effect of Christian sexual regulation, intensifying the very desires it sought to control, became a crucial component of later developments in modern culture. Foucault's analysis of Christian confession helps explain why modern Western culture became so focused on individual interiority, psychological examination, and therapeutic intervention. Many practices that we consider secular and scientific psychoanalysis, counseling, social work, criminology, actually have deep historical roots in Christian techniques for examining and transforming the self. Understanding these historical connections helps us think more critically about contemporary institutions and practices that claim scientific or therapeutic authority over human behavior. It also helps us recognize alternatives that might be available if we were willing to question some of the basic assumptions that we have inherited from Christian culture about the nature of selfhood and the necessity of expert interpretation of human experience. Part 14. Resistance, Freedom and Counterconducts. The possibility of thinking and living differently. Throughout his career, Foucault was deeply concerned with questions of resistance, freedom, and the possibility of living and thinking differently within modern systems of power and knowledge. Foucault's analysis reveals how power, subjectification, and resistance are interconnected processes that shape modern subjectivity. He argued that power relations always create possibilities for resistance, and that understanding how power works provides tools for developing more effective forms of opposition and alternative ways of life. But Foucault's approach to resistance was subtle and complex, avoiding both naive optimism about human liberation and pessimistic determinism about social control. Power, subjectification and resistance in Foucault shows that Foucault thinks that there is a resistance opportunity wherever power is available. Resistance means in some ways setting forth a different discourse and developing a game other than the power game. Therefore, Foucault, who thinks that when power is at stake, one should go out of the existing game and leave the state out of the game, makes a critical room for philosophy at this point. This approach to resistance differs significantly from traditional revolutionary politics that seeks to overthrow existing power structures and replace them with alternative institutions. Instead, Foucault was interested in what he called counter-conducts, practices and discourses that work within existing power relations, but create spaces for different ways of thinking and living. Foucault's understanding of power emphasizes its productive and creative aspects, showing how it generates new forms of knowledge, subjectivity and resistance. This means that resistance is not simply opposition to power, but is actually produced by power relations themselves. Every system of power creates its own forms of opposition by establishing norms that some people will inevitably challenge or fail to meet. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why resistance often takes unexpected forms and why it emerges in places and ways that traditional political analysis might not anticipate. For example, Foucault's analysis of the prison system in Discipline and Punish revealed how the creation of criminal identity actually produced new forms of resistance and political organization. When people were classified as criminals and subjected to systematic surveillance and normalization, they developed new forms of solidarity and opposition based on their shared experience of criminalization. Prison riots, criminal networks and prisoner rights movements all emerged as responses to disciplinary power, even though they were not necessarily planned or intended by prison administrators. The attempt to create docile subjects actually created new forms of political subjectivity and collective action. Similarly, Foucault's analysis of sexuality showed how the medical and psychiatric classification of sexual deviance created possibilities for new forms of sexual identity and political mobilization. When same-sex desire was classified as homosexuality and treated as a medical condition, people who experienced such desires began to organize around this identity and to challenge its pathological classification. Gay rights movements emerged partly as responses to medical and legal forms of sexual regulation, using the very categories that had been created to control them as resources for political organization and cultural recognition. The deployment of sexuality created new forms of sexual subjectification, but it also created new possibilities for sexual politics and resistance. Foucault was particularly interested in forms of resistance that worked by creating alternative ways of relating to oneself rather than by directly challenging political institutions. This is where his work on ancient ethics and technologies of the self became politically relevant. If modern subjects are created through specific techniques of normalization, examination and confession, then different techniques might create different kinds of subjects. Practices of ethical self-cultivation might provide ways of constituting oneself that are not completely determined by dominant social institutions and discourses. This approach to resistance through ethical self-transformation has been particularly influential in contemporary social movements. Feminist movements have developed new practices of consciousness-raising and collective support that create alternatives to individualistic therapeutic approaches. LGBTQ movements have created new practices of coming out and community building that constitute alternatives to both pathological medicalization and closeted privacy. Environmental movements have developed new practices of sustainable living and ecological awareness that constitute alternatives to consumer capitalism. All of these movements involve not just political opposition, but the creation of alternative forms of subjectivity and social relationship. But Foucault also recognized the limitations and dangers of focusing exclusively on individual transformation without attention to broader structural changes. Technologies of the self can easily be co-opted by existing power relations and turned into new forms of social control. Self-help practices, therapeutic interventions, and lifestyle politics can all serve to reinforce existing inequalities and to deflect attention from the need for more fundamental social transformation. The challenge is to develop practices of ethical self-cultivation that contribute to broader social and political change rather than simply serving individual development or personal satisfaction. Foucault's approach to freedom was similarly complex and nuanced. Rather than understanding freedom as the absence of constraint or the ability to do whatever one wants, he understood freedom as the possibility of acting differently within existing conditions of constraint. Freedom is not a natural human capacity that can be unleashed by removing external obstacles, but a historical achievement that must be constantly created and maintained through specific practices and struggles. This understanding of freedom emphasizes its practical and creative dimensions, rather than treating it as an abstract philosophical concept or natural right. Foucault's analysis of the subject and power provides tools for critical reflection on the forces that shape who we are and who we might become. He was particularly interested in what he called limit experiences, situations that push people to the boundaries of conventional categories and create possibilities for thinking and living differently. These might include experiences of madness, criminality, sexual deviance, or other forms of marginalization that force people outside normal social categories and create opportunities for alternative forms of self-understanding. But they might also include more mundane experiences of questioning, experimentation, and creative practice that challenge taken-for-granted assumptions about selfhood and social life. Understanding resistance as counter-conduct rather than revolution also has implications for how we think about political strategy and social change. Rather than focusing exclusively on capturing state power or overthrowing economic systems, this approach emphasizes the importance of creating alternative practices and discourses that can exist alongside and within existing power relations. This might involve developing alternative educational practices, creating new forms of community organization, experimenting with different approaches to work and economic exchange, or cultivating different relationships to technology and consumption. The goal is not necessarily to replace existing institutions immediately, but to create spaces for different ways of living that can serve as models and resources for broader social transformation. But Foucault's approach to resistance and freedom was not without its critics. Some argued that his focus on discourse and subjectification neglected the importance of material conditions and structural inequalities. Others argued that his emphasis on individual transformation and local resistance deflected attention from the need for collective political action and systematic social change. Still others worried that his genealogical method was primarily critical and destructive, without providing sufficient resources for constructive political vision and action. Foucault acknowledged some of these concerns and tried to address them in his later work. He emphasized that genealogical analysis was intended not to promote nihilism or relativism, but to create possibilities for thinking and acting differently. By showing that current arrangements are historical constructions rather than natural necessities, genealogy opens up space for imagining and creating alternatives. Rather than asking what, in the apparently contingent, is actually necessary, he suggests asking what, in the apparently necessary, might be contingent. This shift in questioning provides tools for political and ethical transformation, even if it does not provide a blueprint for an ideal society. Ultimately, Foucault's approach to resistance, freedom and political change emphasizes the importance of experimentation, creativity and ongoing struggle rather than final solutions or ultimate liberation. He believed that human freedom is always fragile and provisional, requiring constant vigilance and creative effort to maintain and extend. This makes political and ethical work a never-ending task that requires both careful analysis of existing conditions and imaginative vision of alternative possibilities. It also requires willingness to take risks, to experiment with new forms of life, and to accept the uncertainty and difficulty that comes with genuine political and ethical transformation. Part 15. The Critique of the Present, Enlightenment, Modernity, and the Question of What We Are. In his later work, Foucault became increasingly interested in what he called the critique of the present, an approach to philosophical and political analysis that examines contemporary conditions not in order to celebrate or condemn them, but in order to understand how they came to be and how they might be different. This approach was deeply influenced by Immanuel Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment?, which Foucault saw as establishing a new form of philosophical reflection focused on understanding the present historical moment and our relationship to it. But Foucault's critique of the present differed significantly from traditional Enlightenment approaches, focusing more on genealogical analysis than on rational principles and more on power relations than on abstract ideas. Foucault's approach to the critique of the present was fundamentally historical and genealogical. Rather than trying to determine what is universally true or rational about human nature and social organization, he tried to understand how particular ways of thinking and living emerged through specific historical processes. Each of his major books is a critique of historical reason that shows how apparently natural and necessary features of modern life are actually the products of contingent historical developments. This genealogical approach to the present reveals that things could have been different and suggests that they can still be changed through human effort and creativity. But Foucault's critique of the present was not simply academic or theoretical. It was motivated by practical and political concerns about how people live and how they might live differently. His goal was not simply to understand the present, but to create possibilities for thinking and acting that are not completely determined by dominant social institutions and discourses. This required developing what he called a critical attitude, a stance of questioning and experimentation that refuses to accept current arrangements as natural or inevitable. Foucault was particularly interested in what he saw as the paradoxes and limitations of modern Enlightenment culture. While Enlightenment ideals of reason, freedom and progress had contributed to many important social improvements, they had also created new forms of domination and control. Modern scientific rationality had produced valuable knowledge about human nature and social organization, but it had also created new possibilities for surveillance, normalization, and social engineering. Modern democratic institutions had expanded political participation and individual rights, but they had also created new forms of governmental control and population management. This ambivalent relationship to Enlightenment and modernity shaped Foucault's approach to contemporary political and ethical questions. He was neither a simple defender of Enlightenment values nor a wholesale critic of modern culture. Instead, he tried to identify what was valuable about Enlightenment ideals, while also revealing the ways that these ideals had been co-opted by systems of power and control. He was particularly interested in how Enlightenment concepts like reason, freedom, and individual rights could be reclaimed and transformed for more genuinely liberating purposes. Foucault's analysis of biopower and governmentality revealed how modern states and institutions exercise power through care and improvement rather than through coercion and punishment. This creates what he saw as a fundamental problem for contemporary political thought and action. Traditional forms of political opposition, revolution, resistance, critique, are designed to oppose overtly repressive forms of power. But how does one oppose forms of power that claim to be working for human welfare and that actually do provide real benefits like healthcare, education and social security? This question became particularly pressing as Foucault observed the development of what he called neoliberalism, a form of governmental rationality that extends market logic into all areas of social life while claiming to promote individual freedom and social efficiency. Neoliberal governmentality creates subjects who are expected to manage themselves as entrepreneurs and to take responsibility for their own success or failure in competitive markets. This appears to promote individual autonomy and reduce state interference in private life, but it actually creates new forms of social control that work through individual self-regulation rather than external coercion. People are not forced to comply with social expectations, but are encouraged to internalize those expectations and to monitor their own performance accordingly. Foucault's critique of neoliberal governmentality has been particularly influential in understanding contemporary political and economic developments. His analysis helps explain why traditional forms of political opposition often seem ineffective against neoliberal policies and why people often support policies that appear to work against their own interests. When power works through the production of desires and aspirations, rather than through coercion and prohibition, resistance requires different strategies and tactics than those developed for opposing overtly repressive regimes. It requires understanding how contemporary subjects are constituted and developing alternative practices of subjectification that can create different possibilities for thought and action. But Foucault's critique of the present was not limited to analysing contemporary forms of power and control. He was also interested in identifying resources within contemporary culture that might support more genuine forms of freedom and creativity. This is where his work on ancient ethics and technologies of the self became particularly relevant to contemporary political and ethical reflection. If modern subjects are constituted through specific practices and discourses, then different practices might constitute different kinds of subjects with different capacities for thought and action. Foucault suggested that contemporary culture might benefit from developing new forms of ethical practice that combine ancient insights about self-cultivation with modern insights about equality, diversity, and social justice. This would not involve simply returning to ancient practices which were deeply embedded in systems of exclusion and hierarchy that would be unacceptable today. Instead, it would involve creating new practices that take seriously both the ancient insight that ethics involves working on oneself and the modern insight that ethical life must be available to everyone, regardless of their social position or background. This might involve developing new forms of education, community organization, cultural practice, and political participation that combine individual development with collective empowerment. Foucault's approach to the critique of the present also emphasized the importance of genealogical analysis for contemporary political and ethical reflection. Understanding how current arrangements came to be provides tools for imagining how they might be different. Genealogical analysis reveals that what appears most natural and permanent about contemporary life is actually the product of particular historical struggles, and could potentially be changed through new forms of struggle and experimentation. This does not mean that change is easy or automatic, but it does mean that change is possible and that human creativity and effort can make a real difference in shaping the future. But Foucault also emphasized that the critique of the present must be ongoing and experimental rather than final or systematic. There is no single correct analysis of contemporary conditions and no blueprint for an ideal society that can guide political action once and for all. Instead, the critique of the present must be constantly renewed as conditions change and as new problems and possibilities emerge. This requires intellectual humility and openness to revision, while also maintaining commitment to the values and goals that motivate critical analysis in the first place. Foucault's approach to the critique of the present has been influential in many areas of contemporary scholarship and political practice. His genealogical methods have been used to analyse developments in education, healthcare, criminal justice, environmental policy, and many other areas of social life. His insights about power, subjectification and resistance have influenced feminist theory, queer theory, critical race theory, post-colonial theory and other approaches to understanding and challenging systems of domination. His emphasis on experimentation and creativity has influenced artistic and cultural practices that seek to create alternative ways of living and thinking within contemporary conditions. Ultimately, Foucault's critique of the present offers tools for thinking about contemporary problems that avoid both naive optimism and cynical pessimism. It suggests that while contemporary conditions involve real constraints and limitations, they also contain possibilities for creativity and transformation that can be realized through careful analysis and strategic action. The task is not to escape from contemporary conditions or to accept them as permanent, but to understand them well enough to work within and against them in ways that create better possibilities for human flourishing and freedom. This requires both rigorous analysis and imaginative vision, both critical understanding and practical experimentation. Part 16. The Enduring Legacy, Foucault's Impact on Contemporary Thought and Politics. Michel Foucault died in 1984, but his influence on contemporary intellectual and political life has only continued to grow. Of the first decade of the 21st century, Foucault is the author most frequently cited in the humanities in general, and his ideas have shaped research and practice in fields ranging from history and philosophy to sociology, psychology, education, medicine and law. More importantly, his insights about power, knowledge, subjectification and resistance have influenced social movements, political organizations and cultural practices around the world. Understanding Foucault's enduring legacy helps us appreciate both the significance of his contributions and the ongoing relevance of his insights for contemporary challenges. Foucault's work offers a complex and challenging picture of human life in modern societies that continues to shape how scholars and activists approach contemporary problems. He showed us that power operates in ways that are much more subtle and pervasive than we usually recognize, working not just through coercion and prohibition, but through the production of knowledge, the constitution of subjects, and the management of populations. This insight has fundamentally changed how people think about politics, revealing that political struggle involves not just conflicts over resources and policies, but also struggles over meaning, identity, and the constitution of social reality itself. One of Foucault's most important contributions has been showing how knowledge and power are inextricably connected in ways that have profound implications for how we understand science, expertise, and social policy. His genealogical analyses revealed that many forms of knowledge that claim scientific objectivity actually reflect particular historical conditions and power relations. This does not mean that all knowledge is equally valid or that scientific methods are worthless, but it does mean that we need to think critically about how knowledge is produced, by whom, for what purposes, and with what effects. This insight has been particularly influential in contemporary debates about expertise, evidence-based policy, and the role of scientific authority in democratic societies. Foucault's analysis of discipline and normalization has been crucial for understanding contemporary institutions and practices that claim to help people while actually controlling them in subtle ways. His insights about how modern power works by establishing norms and encouraging conformity rather than by simply prohibiting behavior have influenced critical analyses of education, healthcare, social work, and criminal justice. These analyses have revealed how apparently benevolent institutions often reproduce inequalities and limit human possibilities, even while claiming to promote welfare and development. But they have also identified opportunities for resistance and alternative practices that can create more genuinely liberating approaches to human development and social organization. The concept of biopower has been particularly influential in understanding contemporary politics and governance. Foucault's analysis of how modern states govern through the management of life processes, health, sexuality, productivity, population dynamics, has provided tools for analyzing developments in public health, reproductive politics, immigration policy, and environmental regulation. His insights about biopolitical racism have been crucial for understanding how seemingly neutral policies about health and welfare can actually reinforce racial, class, and other forms of inequality. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, revealed both the importance and the limitations of biopolitical governance, as public health measures had very different effects on different populations depending on their social position and resources. Foucault's work on sexuality and subjectification has been foundational for contemporary movements around gender, sexuality, and identity. His genealogy of sexuality revealed that many categories we take for granted, homosexuality, heterosexuality, normal and deviant sexuality, are actually historical constructions that could be different. This insight has been crucial for LGBTQ movements that have challenged the pathologization of non-normative sexualities while also creating new forms of identity and community. But it has also raised complex questions about the politics of identity and the relationship between liberation and normalization that continue to be debated in contemporary queer and feminist theory. Similarly, Foucault's analysis of how modern subjects are constituted through various practices of examination, confession and normalization has influenced critical approaches to psychology, therapy and self-help culture. His work has inspired alternatives to individualistic therapeutic approaches that focus instead on collective support, political analysis and social change. It has also contributed to critical analyses of how contemporary consumer culture encourages people to constantly work on themselves, to optimize their health, enhance their productivity, improve their relationships, in ways that can actually increase rather than reduce anxiety and dissatisfaction. Understanding these dynamics has been important for developing more sustainable and fulfilling approaches to personal development and social change. Foucault's work on ancient ethics and technologies of the self has opened up new possibilities for thinking about contemporary ethical and political practice. His investigation of how ancient people developed practices for ethical self-cultivation has inspired contemporary experiments in community building, spiritual practice, and alternative approaches to education and personal development. But it has also raised important questions about how to adapt ancient insights to contemporary conditions in ways that avoid the exclusions and hierarchies that characterized ancient societies. The challenge is to develop new forms of ethical practice that take seriously both individual development and social justice, both personal transformation and collective empowerment. The concept of governmentality has been particularly influential in understanding neoliberalism and contemporary forms of economic and political governance. Foucault's analysis of how modern power works by shaping desires and aspirations rather than simply constraining behaviour has provided tools for understanding why neoliberal policies often enjoy popular support, even when they seem to work against people's interests. His insights about entrepreneurial subjectivity have been crucial for analysing how people are encouraged to think of themselves as individual entrepreneurs responsible for their own success or failure in competitive markets. This analysis has influenced both scholarly research and political organising around issues like education policy, healthcare, social welfare and labour rights. But Foucault's work has also been subject to significant criticism and debate. Some critics argue that his focus on discourse and power relations neglects material conditions and structural inequalities. Others worry that his genealogical method promotes relativism and nihilism by showing that all truth claims are historically contingent. Still others argue that his emphasis on local resistance and individual transformation deflects attention from the need for systematic political change and collective action. These criticisms have generated productive debates that have refined and extended Foucault's insights. Contemporary scholars have worked to integrate Foucauldian analysis with attention to economic structures, racial dynamics, gender relations, and global power relations. They have developed more sophisticated understandings of how discourse and materiality interact, how local and global processes connect, and how individual and collective transformation can be mutually reinforcing. This work has created richer and more nuanced approaches to understanding and challenging contemporary forms of power and domination. Perhaps most importantly, Foucault's work continues to provide tools for what he called the critique of the present ongoing analysis of contemporary conditions that reveals both their constraints and their possibilities. His genealogical methods continue to be valuable for understanding how current arrangements came to be and how they might be different. His insights about power, knowledge and subjectification continue to be relevant for analysing new developments in technology, governance and social organisation. His emphasis on experimentation and creativity continues to inspire efforts to create alternative ways of living and thinking within contemporary conditions. Ultimately, Foucault's enduring legacy lies not in any particular theory or method, but in his demonstration that human arrangements are historical constructions that can be analysed, criticised, and potentially changed. Rather than asking what in the apparently contingent is actually necessary, he suggests asking what in the apparently necessary might be contingent. This shift in perspective opens up possibilities for thinking and acting that are not completely determined by dominant institutions and discourses. It provides tools for working toward futures that are more just, more free, and more conducive to human flourishing than current arrangements allow. Foucault's philosophy offers no easy answers or final solutions to contemporary problems. Instead, it provides tools for ongoing critical thinking and creative action that can respond to changing conditions and emerging challenges. In a world where power and knowledge are increasingly complex and pervasive, where new technologies create new possibilities for both liberation and control, and where global problems require both local and collective responses, his insights remain more relevant than ever. They offer resources for anyone who wants to understand how to live thoughtfully and responsively in contemporary societies while working to create better possibilities for future generations.